Okay, everyone, I am ready to introduce our next speaker, Edita Birnkrant. And I want to tell you, before I read the autobiographical information here, that I had the great satisfaction last year at the Animal Rights National Convention in Washington, D.C., to attend the session that Edita and Hope put on together, combining the farmed animal issue and the environmental issue and showing that they're part of the same issue. And I was just so affected and moved by their presentation together that I just thought it would be wonderful to have Edita speak at our conference this year. So, Edita Birnkrant is the campaigns director of Friends of Animals, which is an international nonprofit animal advocacy organization founded in 1957. Edita runs Friends of Animals' New York office and all national campaigns, leading efforts to ban horse-drawn carriages and other forms of quote-unquote entertainment that exploit animals, challenge the fur trade, transform policies for urban and suburban wildlife and birds, and protect the last of America's wild horses, in addition to promoting veganism and vegan advocacy. Edita is going to speak about free-range ranching and animal agriculture's devastating impact on the environment and wildlife. Please welcome Edita Birnkrant. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Very, very happy to be here. So that was a great intro. I'm not going to go too much into what Friends of Animals does. You can come by our table later, but we run an animal sanctuary with mainly primates rescued from animal research or from the entertainment industry. We have a chimpanzee rehabilitation project in Africa, other wildlife projects in Africa. We have a low-cost spay-neuter program throughout the whole country. We have a wildlife law program, vegan advocacy, of course. So I'm just going to jump right into the presentation. So the world is on the brink of what is being called the sixth great extinction, and species are disappearing faster than ever before. A study released recently by the journal Science highlighted that species of plants and animals are becoming extinct at least 1,000 times faster than they did before humans were around. It found that species are now disappearing from Earth about 10 times faster than biologists had believed. And there have been 5 times previously when a vast majority of the world's life has been obliterated in what have been called mass extinctions. And these are often associated with giant meteor strikes. So now we are literally on the verge of the 6th extinction, and whether we turn things around or not will depend completely on humanity's actions, and specifically on how we feed ourselves. So what has led us to being on the brink of this 6th extinction? So the number one cause is habitat loss. Species are increasingly finding no place to survive due to human overdevelopment into areas that were once the natural habitat of wildlife. And directly connected to this is animal agriculture, which is responsible for an immense amount of habitat destruction. And in addition to the habitat loss to creating animal farms, an alarming number of wildlife are killed off by free-range animal farmers and government agencies who claim that wild horses, bison, wolves, coyotes, and other predators are a threat to livestock or simply have no right to exist on the land. So the number one cause is directly at the hands of human behavior. Another key factor is climate change, which affects where species can survive. And a significant cause of climate change is animal agriculture. So fishing is another chief factor leading to the 6th extinction. We have decimated ocean life. And I think we need to officially retire the phrase overfishing. How many of you have heard that phrase used? Because at this point, any and all fishing is overfishing. Among the most serious threats to marine species worldwide is the voracious human appetite for seafood. Again, diet and what we are eating is the root cause. Stocks of all marine species fished for food are set to collapse by 2048. So that's alarming, and that's why it's very important to understand that there is no such thing as sustainable seafood when this situation is this dire. But sustainable seafood is one of these feel-good, meaningless buzzwords thrown around, which seeks to deny the reality that all fishing must stop, and therefore all fish eating must stop. So, without a doubt, educating and helping people realize how critically important it is to switch to a plant-based vegan diet is crucial. Literally billions of land animals every year are bred and slaughtered just for food products in the US alone, and ocean life is decimated, resulting in immense suffering, devastation to our environment, and human health. Nearly half of Earth's entire landmass is used for farming, with a staggering 30% of Earth's land surface used for livestock. I mean, really let that sink in, how shocking it is to think that 30% of the planet's entire land surface is used to raise livestock that are to be slaughtered. I think it's very obvious to anyone that this is not a sustainable situation on a planet with over 7 billion people and growing. So to put that into context, we have 7 billion people on the planet and over 70 billion animals used for food. And just in the course of this talk, in an extra 20 minutes, an hour, more than 6 million animals are killed for food every hour. And that's just the land animals. It doesn't include fish. And the waste that all these animals produce is 130 times more than human waste is produced in the US. So it's 1.4 billion tons of waste from the meat industry annually. And of course, that's a major source of air and water pollution and human illnesses. So how we feed the planet's population, which is estimated to be at 9 billion people by 2050, is one of the most, if not the most important questions to answer in terms of what kind of world we will inhabit in the near and long-term future. Of all the agricultural land in the US, 80% is used to raise animals for food and grow grain to feed them. That's almost half the total land mass of the lower 48 states. And when you think of that in terms of food justice and just a social justice issue, it's absolutely a disgrace that 80% of agricultural land is used for animal farming. And in terms of the land, land required to feed one average person for 1 year, so a vegan requires 1/6 an acre of land to feed themselves for a year. A vegetarian requires 3 times as much land as a vegan, and a meat eater requires 18 times as much as land as a vegan. So that's a pretty significant difference. And 1.5 acres can produce 37,000 pounds of plant-based food, and in stark contrast, 1.5 acres can produce only 375 pounds of meat. So it's a huge difference. In terms of weight, if you can kind of visualize, because I think this is a really shocking statistic, if you think in terms of weight of the percentage of tons of the planet taken up by humans and livestock versus wildlife, it's really unbelievable. So there are 425 million tons of humans and livestock combined, and only 10 million tons of all wildlife on the entire planet. So it has drastically shifted from, the way it was a long time ago. And I want to go into the topic of water, which is a very hot topic here in California, no pun intended. So, the question of what is the water footprint of food, that's been something that's been discussed a lot lately because of the situation here. So it takes 2,500 gallons of water or more to produce 1 pound of beef, and it takes 1,000 gallons of water to produce 1 gallon of milk. So I kind of have a scale here showing the vast difference of, the very high water footprint of all animal products versus the lower impact of the fruits and vegetables we have here. And it is true that certain plant-based foods like nuts and beans have a little bit of a higher water footprint than what's here, but it's absolutely so much lower than any of the animal products. So throughout the world, just humans, drink 5.2 billion gallons of water and eat 21 billion pounds of food each day. And worldwide, just cows, drink 45 billion gallons of water and eat 135 billion pounds of food each day. I mean, that's just, every time I read that, I'm still shocked. It's so disturbing. So worldwide, meat and dairy industries use 30% of the world's water. That's the entire planet. And of course, Western states are enduring a severe drought, including right where we are now, California, which is still enduring the worst drought in the state's history. And last year, on April 2nd, California, Governor Brown instituted a mandatory 25% water use reduction rate for the first time in the state's history. Yet large farms were exempt from this reduction, despite the fact that roughly 80% of California's water supply is used by agriculture. The bulk of it, animal agriculture, which uses about 50%. And I know probably a lot of you know that almonds were given a very bad rap in all of this. That was completely false to blame the water usage situation on almonds, when in fact, the truth is that the real culprit was alfalfa, which is grown on over 1 million acres in California. Alfalfa sucks up more water than any other crop in the state. And it has one primary destination. Can anyone guess? Yes, cattle. And increasingly popular grass-fed beef operations typically rely on alfalfa as a supplement to pasture grass. And alfalfa hay is also an integral feed source for industrial farmed cows, especially those involved in dairy production. And the alfalfa being used by farms as feed for cows isn't even being all eaten in the US. So Californians are actually sending their alfalfa and therefore their water to Asia. And alfalfa growers are now exporting some 100 billion gallons of water from this drought-ridden region to the other side of the world in the form of alfalfa. And this is all as more Asians are embracing the American-style meat-hungry diet. So that was the real culprit that didn't exactly get as much press as it should have. So scientists have predicted in a new study that by this century's end, the American West will face a historic mega drought, the worst drought in 1,000 years, if the world stays on its current trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions. Yet, how many in the scientific community or in government are connecting the dots and pointing the finger at animal agriculture and at the dietary choices that are putting us all at risk? And as Hope spoke about earlier, it's very important to realize that animal products labeled as free-range, grass-fed, or cage-free are not the solution at all. And consumers and the public and all of you here should not buy into the myth that these products are somehow more humane or more sustainable for the environment. So, of course, massive industrial farms are hell on earth for animals. That's without a doubt. But these other animal farming models that are often associated as ethically superior and environmentally superior are anything but. So these are just some of the labels here that you'll often see in the supermarket. These humanely raised labels often are virtually meaningless or downright fraudulent, and they really have little to no federal oversight, and as Hope went into, the animals killed under these labels still often endure horrific living and dying conditions, the same or worse as they do on industrial farms. And as you know, this is companies decide independently what to call humane, and the USDA merely verifies it. So it really is fraudulent. And as Hope went into about that we should kind of stop using the term factory farming, I think it's been a very popular kind of mantra and campaign that we have to end factory farming. And of course, we do have to. Factory farming is a nightmare, but if we're asking to end something, what are we advocating should replace it? And that's a very important question. And unfortunately, many consumers have translated the end factory farming message to equal buy humanely raised or free range, cage-free, sustainable, or local animal products. And we really have to evolve beyond that. Because in fact, those particular products have separate issues that devastate wildlife and the environment even more so than industrial farms. And this is just some pictures from, these free, what would be considered free range or humane farms. So of course the problem is there's no such thing as humanely raised and killed animal products, but the public is being duped into believing there is. And I call it the happy meat market. It's really exploded in the past several years. So in essence, the message being given to the public is that you can be an animal rights activist and environmentalist by eating animals exploited and killed if they have these specific labels on them. And that's completely false. And as the demand, so this is, buy humane meat. As the demand for free-range and pasture-grazed animal products grows, and it is growing, so does the demand by ranchers for more livestock grazing areas. It's simply not possible to continue to produce the amount of animal products that the public currently eats by switching from conventional industrial farms to free-range farms. So just an example, I have a slide here. This talks about it'll go into what USDA Wildlife Services does. Just for cows, if we raised all the cows in the United States on grass, meaning we release them from the industrial farms, it would require using half the country's land. That's just for cows. So you see when you actually put these theories into practice how absurd they are. So the reality, and then there's also issues of, in terms of health, a 2009 study found higher rates of salmonella in free-range pigs. The reality is that substituting free-range grazing practices for intensively confined animals would drastically increase already perilous levels of wildlife habitat loss and species endangerment or extinction. So the bottom line is that there's just no way to do it that doesn't destroy the environment and wipe out other species. The only sustainable way to feed over 7 billion people and growing is through a plant-based diet. So our goal has to be to lessen the demand and to shift people away from eating animal products, regardless of whether those products come from industrial, factory farms, or free-range farms. I'm not supposed to use the term factory farm, so just delete that. But it is true that it's in your head and it's hard to get beyond that, but I think it's very important to stop using that term.
But the point I think we're making here, too, is that they're all factory farms.
Yes, really. It's all a factory, yeah. It's just a different, yeah. Exactly.
Imprisoned in.
Exactly. So, and if you've ever been inside, this is a Whole Foods in Manhattan. That was the butcher who apparently didn't appreciate me taking pictures of him as he was butchering. But you see the giant sign behind him, the 5-step animal welfare rating program that Whole Foods has. So, if you've ever been inside a Whole Foods, I bet all of you have been inside one, you've likely seen the meat section, which is covered in marketing slogans aimed at convincing shoppers that the dead packaged animals for sale all led wonderful lives. The meat cases are covered in messages related to their 5-step animal welfare rating program, which you see on the top of, you can't really look at the meat section without seeing all these things. It's everywhere. They even have a color brochure entitled Animal Welfare that looks like it's promoting an animal sanctuary. I mean, that's what you would think. This is beautiful land with cows, happy turkeys and pigs. But really, this details the very animals for sale at the meat counter that have the seal of approval under Whole Foods rating program. I meant to bring the actual pamphlet with me to pass around, but you can pick one up at any of your Whole Foods. And inside the pamphlet is this description about the Global Animal Partnership and its connection to Whole Foods' 5-step animal welfare rating program. And it's disturbing. And it says, as of June 2012, and now the numbers will be higher, approximately 1,900 operations that supply Whole Foods markets, raising more than 147 million animals annually, are certified step-rated farms. That's a staggering number, and that's not even the total number of meat and animal products sold at Whole Foods. It's just the one under their rating system. And the truth is that Whole Foods has become one of the country's largest meat and animal product sellers for Happy Meat. And I'm sure that these numbers are much higher as of 2016 because many more are opening up. New Whole Foods markets are opening up everywhere, and Trader Joe's and many other markets now sell Happy Meat products as well. The market has really exploded, and it's easier than ever to be fooled by the humane hoax. It's very easy for the public to believe that they can continue to eat all the meat, dairy, and eggs they want and still be making a compassionate, sustainable, environmentally correct choice. And as Hope was pointing out, that, all these products being peddled at Whole Foods and these other places are being portrayed as the opposite of the evil that goes on at factory farms, and that it has the effect of the goalposts being moved, like away from veganism as the humane, responsible choice for consumers, and instead towards humane animal products. And actually, these, again, you would think this is from a animal sanctuary. This is photos on the website of Nyman Ranch, which you probably are all. It's one of the largest Happy Meat farms, and that's the owner of Nyman Ranch cradling a young goat. I mean, these are all the animals to be slaughtered that will turn run into, lamb, they put raised with care on their label for the meat, and fearless Franks. It's so Orwellian and disturbing. Compassion for our animals, that they use that word. It's so wrong. So lastly, there is the issue of available land. As it is, the rapidly expanding human population is constantly reducing the amount of land available for farming, as well as rapidly deforesting the small percentage of wildlands that remain. So producing humane animal products requires at least double the amount of land required for the industrialized style of farming adopted in wealthy countries over the last several decades. In some cases, it takes several times more land to convert to so-called humane methods. And these are just some of the wildlife species that are considered collateral damage by our own government agencies that wipe them out merely because of ranchers, free-range ranchers, because they are getting the priority on our public lands. It's insane. The reality is that vastly more high-quality farmland would be needed to convert existing production to so-called humane farming. That amount of land is simply not available on the scale needed to meet the rapidly growing worldwide demand for animal products. And it's also important to realize that as more wildlands are converted into humane farmland, more and more free-living animals will be displaced or killed, and more species will be driven to extinction. These are just some of them that I list here that are kind of at the most risk right now. And beyond the animals killed directly for these free-range animal products, the cost to wildlife is huge. Wild horses in burrows, bison, wolves, coyotes, bobcats, bears, mountain lions, foxes, prairie dogs, and more are being systematically wiped out by our government agencies who act in the interest of free-range ranchers. Have most of you heard of agency Wildlife Services? So they're pretty villainous. They kill millions of endangered and predator species every year to help livestock operators. That's the sole reason that our tax dollars go for this. Some of the gruesome methods used for killing these animals are poisons, steel jaw leg hold traps, strangulation neck snares, denning, which is the killing of coyote pups in their dens, hounding, shooting, and aerial gutting at an annual cost to taxpayers of over $115 million. And I'm sure all of you have much better ideas for where to spend $115 million than torturing and killing wildlife. But this is what's going on, and I think many people who buy into the humane myth and think that these products are better have no idea that this is the direct result of these products. In total, the federal government owns around 640 million acres of public land, with cattle grazing taking up a solid 42% of this supposedly protected space. And Friends of Animals, we believe that no public land there should be no grazing or livestock operations on any public lands. These should be protected spaces. So, additionally, we see the populations of animals such as wolves and wild horses being wiped out because of cattle and sheep ranching. And as I say here, the numbers are even lower now. There's less than 35,000 wild horses in the U.S. And the wild horses, the few that are getting blamed for damaging the lands when it's really the millions of cattle and sheep that are doing this. And as a note, livestock grazing on public lands was highly contentious when it was first proposed in the early 1900s. John Muir, who I'm sure you all know, was vehemently opposed to it. So there's around 21,540 ranchers who have been given permits by the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, or U.S. Forest Service, to turn these wild places into feeding grounds for their livestock. And these are supposed to be our public lands. A number of federal agencies rent out their lands to free-range cattle ranchers. These lands encompass national parks, forests, and protected rangelands. And as an aside, there's also hunting allowed on most of these places. There should be no hunting on wildlife refuges or any of these lands, but it is allowed on almost all of them. Introducing cattle or sheep to these areas causes significant ecological damage. Public lands were never meant to be turned into livestock pasture land. These places are filled with native plants and animal species that have developed to live in tune with the local environment. When livestock are introduced to these regions, here's essentially what happens. The land dries up and the native species die off, and that is exactly what happens. And, we see what's happening to the wild horses here. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that product, but the situation for the wild horses in the West is especially dire. They're being brutally rounded up and removed from the public lands they are supposed to be protected by law to be living freely on. So the roundups are physically torturous and indiscriminate as the young, old, and even pregnant mares are forced into a violent stampede by helicopters over rocky and dangerous terrain. So the horses who don't collapse in exhaustion or become injured or die are corralled into holding pens for life. And I actually took that picture of a holding pen, I think it was in Wyoming. And they're often sold to questionable buyers, some of which include slaughterhouses in Mexico and Canada. But basically, their lives are over as soon as they're rounded up, as the close-knit family horse bands that take years to form are forever destroyed, and they're just kept in these little wastelands. And my organization recently rescued a very young horse orphaned from one of these horrific roundups in Colorado, and she's named Moxie for her incredible will to live, and she's doing really well in our sanctuary, and it's a rare happy ending. So why is this going on? Again, to drive the point home, this is just pictures of, close-ups of the situation, and there's video of this online. It's going on because free-range cattle and sheep ranchers don't want them on the land. They don't want to share the land, and our government is doing their bidding by exterminating them. And these public lands ranchers are often called welfare ranchers because they're heavily subsidized by the government, and they actually receive $1 billion of our tax dollars just in the last decade. And these are pictures of wild horses that I took out, on the lands. And of course, one of the holding pens, you see the difference of how they live in their family bands, and they're very emotionally and physically connected to the family bands, and to be ripped apart and put into these places and sent to slaughter or thrown away like garbage. I've been able to observe these wild horses in these Western states, and it's a wonderful sight, and I encourage all of you to do that if you can, but it's one that just is not going to be here for future generations if things don't change. We're very involved in the wild horse issue. We're legally challenging roundups, and we had a recent legal victory in Nevada with a lawsuit where we stopped a roundup of hundreds of horses it was called the Pine Nut Mountain Range from happening, and we filed other lawsuits. And we've legally petitioned the government to list wild horses under the Endangered Species Act, because we believe that legally that's the only way to preserve the species from extinction, because that's where it's heading. So all federal and state public land should be preserved exclusively for wildlife, and that's really what we have to move towards. But the opposite is the reality today, where ranchers graze millions of cattle and sheep at a devastating cost to the environment and to the wildlife being wiped out in the process. This is the true face of free-range farming that many people are... this is just pictures of the pine nut wild horse herd that we did save from a roundup, and that was a great victory, a rare victory, because it's very hard to go up and sue the government and win in these cases, but we're continuing that. So this is really the true face of free-range farming that many people are completely unaware of. And if you leave here with nothing else today from this talk, remember that in every package of Happy Meat, every carton of free-range milk and eggs, there is a lot of dead wildlife that's considered merely collateral damage. And if you buy it and if you consume it, it's being done in your name. And this is an issue that's happening right now, actually. Maybe you've heard about it. America's last remaining wild bison in the West are being wiped out for the same reason. Free-range ranchers want them dead. Today, Yellowstone Park has the last few thousand genetically intact bison left in the United States. This is the last of them, as well as one of only three free-roaming bison herds left in the country. But that number is actually too low to ensure a genetically healthy population of buffalo. And millions of tourists visit the park each year to see these animals, and it's a top attraction. This is the nation's first national park, and the animals are literally the symbol of the National Park Service. Yet, when buffalo migrate beyond the park and enter into Montana, the Department of Livestock officials destroy America's last buffalo merely for stepping across a line into Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And right now, bison are being captured from Yellowstone Park and sent to slaughterhouses. This is a story that has been covered widely by media recently. The reason this is happening is because the livestock industry claims that the bison have a disease that can be transferred to their cattle. Ranchers worry about bison infected with brucellosis. It's a disease that can cause cattle to abort their young. But there have been no no recorded bison to cattle transmissions of brucellosis, so the hysteria and fear stirred up by the cattle ranchers has absolutely no basis in reality, yet the bison are still being killed. Hunters so far this winter have killed more than 400 of the animals, and that's the most since 1989, and the vast majority were shot by members of American Indian tribes that have treaty hunting rights in the Yellowstone region. And there have been an unprecedented number of animals that were merely wounded and retreated to the park after being shot. And imagine visitors to the park seeing these suffering, dying bison that maybe they came specifically to see. Up to 50 wounded bison were killed by state and federal wildlife agents. It's an absolute disgrace that the last remaining wild herds of this iconic American species are being treated like pests who must be destroyed to benefit free-range cattle ranchers. And we also have a legal effort underway to get wild bison listed under the Endangered Species Act. And my point in connecting all these issues is that there is no better way to breed, raise, and slaughter billions of animals for food. The answer is to shift completely away from animal agriculture, which is inherently violent, unsustainable, and egregiously wasteful of precious resources on every level, and to shift towards a plant-based diet, which, it's a fact, uses so many less resources. And just because I want to end on more of a positive note, because this is a lot of heavy information, I thought that last year, I don't know if you all heard about this story, but it was the first time that the Federal Committee of Nutritionists that decides, it's a federal panel that helps set the dietary guidelines, which are incredibly important for what kids eat in schools and just how it affects the American diet. It was the first time last year that they recommended Americans eat less meat because it's better for the environment, and they wanted to include environmental sustainability in it. And that, one of the quotes from one of the panel, which is the organically grown vegan diet also, this was a big shift to have a federal panel make these kind of statements, but unfortunately, what happened is the meat industries freaked out and went nuts when they saw this. There was a lot of pushback. They went crazy. And unfortunately, the government chose not to include the committee's recommendations in the final guidelines. However, it was still a progress that this even happened, and the public was allowed to submit comments, and the dietary guidelines are updated every 5 years. So it's moving towards a shift to including the environment and sustainability in these guidelines. And when the new guidelines are proposed in 2050, all of us should send in comments urging the government to do what they should have done this time in 2015, to acknowledge that what we eat has a huge influence not just on our personal health, but the health of the planet and all of the non-human inhabitants. And another positive shift that I wanted to talk about is that the 68th UN General Assembly declared 2016 the International Year of Pulses. Does everyone know what pulses are? I actually had to look it up too. It's just legumes, so beans and dry seeds. So in order to fight climate change, the UN has declared 2016 the International Year of Pulses. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has been nominated to facilitate the implementation of the year in collaboration with government, relevant organizations, and other stakeholders. And the aim is to heighten public awareness of the nutritional benefits of pulses as part of sustainable food production aimed towards food security and nutrition. And the year will create an opportunity to encourage connections throughout the food chain that would better utilize plant-based proteins, further global production of pulses, and better utilize crop rotations. And as we all know, legumes and beans are rich in nutrients, have exceptional health benefits, are economically affordable, and contribute to food security and sustainability worldwide, as well as help fight climate change. And it's time for a global shift towards a diet that benefits all and harms none. And this is just sort of their social media infographic that I thought was very well done. And they're promoting this widely, kind of just goes into some of what I talked about, the water efficiency of pulses compared to other protein sources, compared to beef, lamb, and chicken, the environmental impacts. So I think that represents a little bit of a shift in the consciousness that, the government is dedicating this year to promoting a plant-based form of protein. And I think that it's kind of indicative of a shift that has been happening, that probably many of you have noticed, that plant-based diets have been becoming more mainstream in society. I think when I became vegan 15 years ago, it was very different. There wasn't all of the products we have now, especially with the vegan cheeses, like nut-based cheeses. Do all of you know of Miyoko's vegan cheese? That's, amazing. And now you can even get her cheeses in New York City and everywhere. I think it's a big game changer. There's a lot of other plant-based cheese companies that are incredible. We have vegan food companies entering the mainstream, like Hampton Creek, which does just mayo, and they've just introduced dozens of other products. There's Beyond Meat, there's Gardein, Impossible Foods, the list goes on. And many of these companies have billions of dollars in investments, people like Bill Gates investing in them. And that shows that, even in the mainstream corporate world, people are seeing that this is the way of the future. And I think that that's something positive that we need to look at, that this is becoming more mainstream, because people do need alternatives. And to see that it's an easy lifestyle to have and transition to, and having these products easily accessible that taste great and are easy to get in supermarkets is a very important part of that. So I see that as something positive, but obviously we have a lot of work to do, but this is progress that we can kind of applaud, and we're going to keep going in that direction. And I definitely glad that all of you are here and learning about all of this. And if you're all new to plant-based diets, stop by the Friends of Animals table. We have a great vegan starter guide that has recipes in there and a lot of information. We have some vegan cookbooks and some other information. So I'm happy to... Do we have time for questions? I don't know how much time we have. Someone has we might as well. Okay. Oh. Okay.
So I just came back last week from the natural
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
show.
Mm-hmm.
All of us back. And it did think about the report.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the first time ever that I've ever heard this in the history of natural products expo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, bison.
But what they did say, which was I think pretty mind-blowing, was at the end of the presentation, what they said was, and the new trend is let thy food be thy medicine.
Mm-hmm. Hippocrates. Yeah.
That was, to me, that was pretty
Yeah. Right.
from that.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. There is definitely a shift in the last few years, especially, and it's continuing in that way. So this is a positive development. But yes.
Another question. The phrase plant-based,
Mm-hmm.
is that phrase an exact synonym for vegan?
I use it that way because it does mean that. I think it's used sometimes. Companies and people like to use that instead of using the word vegan because they feel like vegan scares people. But I personally think we need to use the word vegan more, because the more people hear it, the less scary and freaky it is. So I think use vegan as much as you can, because it needs to become more mainstream and not weird. And, and beyond places like in Berkeley and New York and vegan, the word vegan is more mainstream, but if you go to other parts of the country, people have maybe never heard it. So there's a lot of differences around the country and the world, but I think almost anywhere you go now, the difference from now of what veganism is and, the ideas about it and then the awareness is much different than it was even 10 years ago. So, but I think I suggest using the word vegan. Yeah. So I think yeah.
So I'm wondering if you've looked into the Organic Consumers Association
Mhm.
and a lot of other large
Yeah.
environmentally
Mhm.
focused organizations are really pushing the whole idea of carbon sequestration and using managed animal grazing
Yeah.
as a means to draw carbon out of the atmosphere and therefore save us from global warming.
Mhm.
And to me, it's a really important issue, and I have watched a number of people be so elated over this idea that they can continue to eat meat
Mhm.
and do good things. So
Right.
I'm wondering if you thought about incorporating that into your
Mhm. Yes, I mean, the organic consumers, they have a conflict of interest because they do have, they're promoting animal farming. It's just, they are like diametrically opposed to the whole vegan philosophy, unfortunately. It doesn't mean that can't change, but they are not exactly open to that. But I think, I know what you're saying, and they are basically very much so promoting the humane myth and the environmental myths of that, and that's a problem.
So I keep asking them, if you're promoting this, free range way of doing things, there's not enough land.
Right.
So why
Yeah.
isn't that message at least coupled with cutting?
They're not going to do that because I think they're like a trade organization basically, and it's about finances, and to do that would give an opposing message to the very farms that are in this association. So that's a tough one because they have an interest in promoting the humane myth and the myth about the environment. And I don't exactly have an easy solution for how to get them to transform that. I just think it needs to be that the public, is demanding these changes, and the humane myth and all of this is more widely known, and the collective consciousness about this shifts, and that there's a lesser demand for these products. That's the only way to kind of change the marketplace. Okay, yeah.
I haven't heard anybody mention the use of antibiotics in their feed.
Right.
How that puts us all in jeopardy.
Yeah, that's in industrial farming uses huge, massive amounts of antibiotics, and that has a lot of health problems. They're not doing that on the smaller scale farms usually, but
In the feed.
it's not, it usually isn't. And if it's an organic farm, they can't even use that. So, but as Hope pointed out, that's why you see some of the cruelest, most horrific treatment of the animals, because they can't give them pain medication or antibiotics if it's an organic label. And I know people who have worked in humane law enforcement and rescued from these, organic humane farms and seen some of the worst horror shows of what the animals endure, specifically because they don't get that. They get that on the massive industrial farms. But yeah, all of that is entering humans through the vast amount of antibiotics, and it goes into the land, the water. So that's a huge problem, but there is really no way for the industrial massive farms, because it's inherent in the production that the animals are just going to be sick all the time. They have to give them antibiotics just to keep them alive long enough to kill them. So that's, that's why they do that, unfortunately. I don't think so, no. I don't think that I don't think any industrial farms would willingly change that practice because they get a benefit from it. And then
Make it illegal.
I don't know of any effort underway to do that. That would be good, but I don't see that happening, unfortunately. Yeah.
What's the difference between bison and goat?
Well, bison were native wildlife that were here from millions of years ago. So the ones in like Yellowstone that I talked about, those are the last genetically intact bison. So buffalo is a related species that usually people consider more of a domestic animal bred for slaughter. But the bison, right, I mean, the bison are, they never were meant to be food animals, the ones that are, the genetically intact bison. But they're very similar. One more question, I think, yeah. Right, yeah. I haven't seen that. I wish they would, because animal agriculture uses way more resources and water than fracking, which is ironic. That gets more attention. I mean, of course, fracking is bad, but usually if it's like a fracking, they're going to kind of be a one-issue organization and they're not going to include that, but that would be great if it was incorporated, because if you're talking about water issues and sustainability, and if you're not talking about animal agriculture, I think if everyone heard of the documentary Cowspiracy, that's great, because that really goes into all of that the failure of a lot of environmental organizations to talk about animal agriculture. And how can you not talk about animal agriculture when that's kind of the number one source of all these things, but it details why they have an interest in not doing that. So I think, again, they need to hear more and get more feedback and pushback from their members and from the public. And I think Cowspiracy actually had the effect of doing that some of these organizations have been more vocal in that, and perhaps it will shift. I mean, it's a certain point you can't deny these things, like we're heading towards the 6th great extinction, as I mentioned, and all of the water issues. We cannot, keep our heads in the sand anymore about this. So all of you should scream from the rooftops about this. And I think I'm getting the please end sign, so I'm going to end. Thank you.